Good morning, boys and girls. I am Marla Davis from the Mississippi Department of Education, and today is Magical Math with Miss Marla. Today's introduction will be about graphing in the coordinate plane. Now, this is a two-part series, so definitely come back and see me. So what will you need for today's session? You will need either a pencil or a marker, some graphing paper, and a ruler or a straight edge. And remember, when we say straight edge, that just basically means anything that you can use to draw a straight line. So what we're going to do in this 5th grade lesson is talk about a geometry standard. And this is the very first time that we actually really dig deep into a large standard at the 5th grade that has a lot of components in it. So we're actually going to start talking about our 5th grade geometry standard, standard number 1. Every time that you see a light bulb, that means that we're going to have to do a lot of thinking, boys and girls. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to look at how long and how big this particular standard is. But we're going to take this standard apart to make sure that you understand every part of it. So let's get started. The first part of this standard says use a pair of perpendicular number lines. So let's stop right there for a moment. When did I start learning about number lines? I learned about number lines back in the 2nd grade. It also says we're going to take those number lines and call them axes to define a coordinate system with the intersection of the lines. We're going to call that the origin, and it's going to be arranged and coincide with the number 0. So let's stop right there for a moment. We're going to take a pair of perpendicular number lines. So let's see what that looks like really quickly. So you remember when you were in 2nd grade and your teacher started teaching you all about number lines. Remember, pair means what? 2. Now, part of our standard says that we must take these number lines and make them perpendicular and arrange them in such a way that the 0 on each number line coincides. So what I want you all to do is think for a moment. Remember, every time I see my light bulb, I'm going to think for a moment. I'm going to tape those down for just a second while you all are thinking about, well, what happens as these two number lines coincide on the number 0? There we go. Little movement this morning. So let's think through that for a moment. I have two number lines that are perpendicular to each other. So what do I think is going to happen here in this area, and this area, and this one? I want you to visualize that if I were possibly going to take a point, or a marker in this case, and I wanted to place points in each one of these regions, how similar or different would those points be? Let's go back to our standard for a moment. And I'm going to take off these really important vocabulary words to make sure that I not only visually see them, but that I also see them and understand them here with my example. So each one of these, again, represent number lines. So I've taken these perpendicular number lines, and I've created what are called axes. But one of the things I want you to remember is that axes has an S on the end, which means that there's more than one. So here's an axis, and here's an axis. Now you may be asking yourself, how do I know the difference between these two? Well, the greatest thing about it is it kind of goes in line with what we know about the alphabet. X comes before Y in the alphabet. So I'm going to label this as my x-axis, and I'm going to label this as my y-axis. Now let's go back to our standard for a moment. It says that once I make the lines perpendicular, I create a series of axes, but it also says I now can define that as a coordinate system. That's a big word, boys and girls, but let's take it off of our standard and understand what does that look like visually. So now I have what's called a coordinate system. And why is it called a coordinate system? Because I'm going to have a series of points in each one of these 4 regions. I want you to think for a moment. Again, how is this part of the coordinate system different from this one, different from this one, and different from this one? Keep thinking, boys and girls. Now let's go back to our standard. So I've taken my perpendicular number lines, I've created an axis, and now those are called my coordinate system. But it also says that when they intersect, they're going to intersect at a place that's called the origin. This is something that's so very important for us 5th graders, the origin. Now, where did my 2 axes actually intersect? They intersect right here in the middle at the point 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label this point where both of my axes, x-axis and y-axis, intersect at a point called the origin. You all are learning quite a lot with this one standard. And remember, the origin is where each one of the lines intersect at the point 0. Awesome, boys and girls. So let's keep going through our standard. I want for you all to continue to read this and look here. It says on each line, you are also going to be given a point in the plane. So let's think through that for a moment. Let's go back to our coordinate system. I would love for you to think about, well, what would happen if I could extend all of the lines vertically across my x-axis and across my y-axis? What do you think that's going to look like? I want you to think for a moment. Extending my lines vertically and horizontally. What do you think that's going to look like visually? So you're probably at home, and depending on if you're at home or if you're in the classroom, you may have multiple representations in your mind about what that could possibly look like. So the good thing about it is it doesn't matter what materials you have at home, you're still going to understand the coordinate plane. So you may have at home a coordinate plane that looks like this. Notice I have my axes. They intersect at a 0, x-axis, y-axis. You may have a coordinate plane that looks like this at home. Still noticing, I still have grid lines, but my axes aren't labeled. You may even have a coordinate plane at home that looks like this. The squares are still a little bit bigger, but still, I can still create an x-axis, a y-axis, and a point 0, which corresponds to the what? You got it, the origin. Most of you have probably gone to your local store like a Walmart or to a Office Depot, and you've probably purchased some paper that looks exactly like this. Now, the good thing about this paper is you can use your pencil, you can use a marker or a highlighter, and you can create the exact same coordinate plane that we talked about a few moments ago. So what I need for you all to do is to take your straight edge, and remember, if you don't have a ruler, you could use a sheet of paper. It works the exact same way. I want for you to create an x-axis, and I want you to create a y-axis. And don't forget, where they intersect is going to be the point 0, 0. So take a moment, and I'd like for you to do just that. Did you come up with something that looks like this? Perpendicular number lines intersect at the point 0. So let's talk about this coordinate plane for a moment. What do you notice as it relates to this coordinate plane? Well, I notice, again, if you remember, there's 4 different sections. Or I'm a 5th grader now, so that means I have to use a little bit more vocabulary. So what I need for you all to do is let's label this as quadrant 1, and I'm going to label this one as a 2. I'll label this one as quadrant 3, and this one, I'm going to call this quadrant 4. Now listen to the word that I'm using, quadrant. The prefix there, excuse me, is quad, and remember quad means 4. So this is quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So let's think through that for a moment. You're probably wondering, well, how can I remember which quadrant and how to label them? So think about the word coordinate plane. Remember, we're talking about a coordinate plane, also known as a coordinate system. That starts with the letter C. So if you think about it, you draw the letter C like this. And we'll do just that. And that's going to help you boys and girls remember which direction you are to label your quadrants. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's go back to our standard for a moment. Our standard says that we should be able to take this information and given a point that's in the plane. A point that's in the plane. So that means that I can take my marker or pen or whatever you have at home, and I can begin to place points anywhere that I want. And I love the origin, so let's go ahead and put a point there. So each place that I have just marked now represents a point. This is a point. This is a point. This is a point, and this is a point. And because they're in different quadrants, they're going to have different characteristics. Let's go back to our standard really quickly. It says that every time that I have a point, it's going to represent an ordered pair. Remember, pair means 2. So let's think through that for a moment. I'm going to look at this point right here, and I'm going to name this as a set or an ordered pair. Remember, pair means 2. The word ordered is very important because it has to be in a particular order. So you're probably asking yourself, well, how do I name this point? So in order to name a point, you have to start at the origin. That's why the origin is so very important. In order to name this point, I'm going to move a certain distance from my x-axis and a certain direction or number of points, in the same direction as my y. So I'm going to start at the origin, move across the x-axis, and then I'm going to move towards the y-axis. So now this point here now represents an ordered pair. So let's see, how do we name that? So I started at 0 and I came over approximately 8 units on the x-axis. So what I'm going to do is make this the ordered pair 8. And then I've got to figure out, well, how far up did I go on my y-axis? So let's look. I came up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this represents the ordered pair 8, 10. You're probably asking yourself, well, how do I keep that in? How do I just make sure that I'm always doing this correctly? Well, let's think about it. X comes before Y in the alphabet. So when it's time for us to name our ordered pairs, X always comes before Y. Let's go back to our standard for a moment. And let's make sure that we're touching all of our vocabulary. So this given point is now in a plane. If you remember, I also called this a coordinate system. Now that we have points represented by ordered pairs, this now becomes a plane. let's finish off with our standard. Here's another cool vocabulary term, coordinates. Let's think through that for a minute. Just kind of like where your house is located, it represents a coordinate on a map. So each one of these ordered pairs represent a coordinate. So I can also call all of my ordered pairs a coordinate. And those coordinates are represented with an X and a Y. My ordered pairs are represented with an X and a Y. Let's go back to our standard again, telling us how exactly to make sure that we're labeling all of our points correctly. Again, how far did you travel from the origin on one of your axes? And the second number indicates how far you traveled in the other direction on the second axis. So I'm just going to take these important terms and place them here. Again, there's one of my axes, and this is going to represent my y-axis. And I'm just going to draw an arrow so that you know exactly which axes I'm talking about. My y-axis, and here's my x-axis. So what I'd like for you all to do now is I want you to think about something for a moment. Right now, at the 5th grade, most of the things that we talk about are going to be in our first quadrant. So let's think through that for a moment. Everything in quadrant 1 is going to have a positive X and a positive Y. What do you think is going to happen when we get to quadrant number 2? Remember, start at the origin and move away in the direction of the x-axis, and then move in the same direction as the y-axis. So if I'm in quadrant 2, my ordered pairs are going to be a little different. They're still going to be ordered pairs, but over here, everything is going to be negative, positive. Negative x values, but still positive y values. Let's move down to quadrant number 3. Again, you start at the origin and move in the direction of the x-axis. And then you move in the same direction as your y. But notice this point is down here. So I'm going to move down. That means that everything in quadrant 3 is going to be negative, negative. And then our last quadrant, which is quadrant number 4. Again, to name an ordered pair or a coordinate, you have to start at the origin. I'm going to move in the direction of the x-axis and in the same direction as the point, which happens to be along this y-axis, is going to represent a positive x and a negative y. Wow. So now what we've done is we've just taken this entire standard here, boys and girls, and we've identified what happens when you take perpendicular lines to create a series of axes that form a coordinate system. They intersect at the origin, and once I'm in that coordinate system, I can give you any point and call it a coordinate. Wonderful, boys and girls. And then we're just going to take these last 2 vocabulary terms off, x coordinate, y coordinate, and we'll do the exact same thing. So here's my x coordinate. And when I put my x coordinate with my y coordinate, I get what's called an ordered pair, x coordinate and y coordinate. So in 5th grade, we only focus on one of the quadrants while we're still learning about the coordinate system. So let's focus right here just on quadrant number 1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a series of points that I would like for you to practice. You have 6 points that I would like for you to graph on your coordinate plane at home. So, how did you do? Let's see if you got them all correct. So you should have one of your points at 1, 0. Remember, x comes first and y is second. So because that y coordinate is 0, that point is going to sit on the axis. It's going to sit on your x-axis. Your next point is 3, 3. Now, what do you notice about that particular point? The x-coordinate and the y-coordinate are the exact same value. So that means that you're going to move in the same, you're going to move the same number of spaces from the origin in the x direction and the y direction. Point C is the point 9, 6. Now 9 is very far away from the origin, 9 units away from 0. And then 6 means you move up 6 points. And then let's go to point D. Point D is at 6, 1, 6 units away from the origin and 1 unit up. And then point E is 2 units away from the origin and 10 units up. And then our very last point, which is point F, is 4 units from the origin and 6 units up. Wow, you did a lot, boys and girls. So let's think about the work that we just did. As I move away from the x-axis, that means that my x values are getting larger. The further up that I move up my y-axis, my y values are getting larger. So let's think about what happens if I bring this point, 8, 10, down here. 8, 4. And I can name this the point 8, 4 because I came over 8 units and I went up 4 units. Now they have the exact same x value, but the y's are just a little bit different. This y is larger, which means it's further above the x-axis. And this y value is much smaller, which means it's closer to the x-axis. Awesome. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions and let's see how you do. Question number 1. Fill in the blank. If the y-coordinate is 0, then the point must lie on the... Talk to your parent or talk to your teacher. What do you think the answer is to fill in that blank? Number 2. The further away a point is from the origin, the blank the value of the x-coordinate. Number 3, the smaller the value of the y-coordinate, the blank the point will be to the x-axis. And I think I just gave that one away to you just a moment ago. Number 4, if 2 points have the same y-coordinate, they are the same distance from the x-axis. So think about the word that belongs there. If 2 points have the same y-coordinate, they are the same distance, the axis. So let's see how you did. Number 1, if the y-coordinate is 0, the point will lie on the x-axis, and we just showed you an example of that. Number 2, the further away a point is from the origin, the larger the value of the x-coordinate. And we just talked about that as well, boys and girls. Number 3, the smaller the value of the y-coordinate, the closer that point is going to be to your x-axis. That just makes sense. Remember, our y's, the larger the number, the higher above the x-axis, the smaller the number, the closer to the x-axis. And then number 4, if 2 points have the same coordinate, if 2 points have the same y-coordinate, they are the same distance above the x-axis. What I want for each one of you to do is to turn around to your parent or turn around to your teacher, and I want you to give each other a high five. It's been my pleasure, boys and girls. Thank you for spending this time with me. Again, I am Miss Marla, and this has been your magical math moment as we introduce and graph in the coordinate plane.